let's get started. I know some people are still walking in, but in the interest of time, I want to actually give a shout out to our December event. Okay, so this actually is so we've been running monthly colloquia on various themes this semester. This is our December one, December 9th. It's in collaboration with industrial and operational engineering. The theme is decision-making with data analytics. It sounds rather vague, but it's actually, I would call this industrial scale decision-making with data analytics, meaning, how an entire health system makes decisions, how an industry, whether it's supply chain shortages, those kind of things. So that's what I mean by industrial scale. December 9th, and on North Campus. So this will be on our website, so check it out. I'm putting this up on behalf of the faculty organizers here. Okay, so today, so in the morning, it'll be our keynote speaker, and then this is the schedule for this morning, the rest of the summit. We had a great time yesterday, and hope you guys will hang around, listen to a bunch of talks, and also be here for the poster awards announcement. I also want to mention at lunchtime, there will be a student lunch with Amgen Director for Data Science, but that actually is for students who pre-registered only. Okay, so now I'm going to ask Ben to come here and introduce our keynote.
All right. Good morning, everyone. It's my great pleasure to welcome you all to day 2 of the Michigan Data Science and AI Summit. My name is Ben Green. I'm an assistant professor at the Ford School of Public Policy, and I'll be the host for this session. So kicking us off this morning is our second keynote speaker of the summit, Mr. David Shor. David is the head of data science at Blue Rose Research. Blue Rose Research uses data science to support strategic decision-making at some of the most important progressive organizations in the country. The team's work includes high-dimensional Bayesian modeling to make accurate inferences from polling data, as well as building data and analytics infrastructure for the progressive left. David has previously worked for the Obama 2012 presidential campaign and Civis Analytics. His ideas have been shared in national outlets such as the New York Times, New York Magazine, and Politico. So today, David will speak to us about the topic of data science and American politics. As we're just 1 week out from the midterm elections, this topic is top of mind for all of us in this room. David's insights will help us make sense of how we got to the 2022 midterms and where politics in the US could go from here. So our session will run until around 9:50. So David will give a presentation, and after that, we'll have time for Q&A. So with that, let me get out of the way and let's get to the main event. Please give a warm welcome to David Shor.
Here's your clicker. Incredible. And here's this, and you are clear.
All right. Incredible. Awesome. So just want to say thanks so much for being here and listening to my talk. It's a real honor to speak here. I'm going to talk more about politics than data science, but there's going to be some data science in there, and I encourage data science questions at the end.
Get you to lapel microphone.
Oh yeah. Oh, try it.
Yes.
Oh, sure.
Oh, you didn't. Sorry.
Oh.
Sorry.
I can
Moving.
I can take it.
Okay.
It's okay.
Sorry about that. I just want to make sure everybody can hear you. We have people in overflow rooms that are using a TV.
Oh. Okay.
Okay.
All right. Can everyone hear me? Great. Microphones are always hard. Okay. So first, I'm just going to say a bit about my shop, who we are, what we do. So Blue Rose Research is a 30-person shop. It's existed for about 2 years. It was founded by alumni of the Obama campaign. I think something that's pretty cool about it is that we've tested, oh, hold on, let me get this microphone up a little further. So something that's quite cool about it is that so far this cycle, we've tested in total 14,000 pieces of content. We worked with almost every major group, I'd say, in the Democratic Party, and did lots of randomized controlled trials to figure out what ads to put on the air, what policies to base your campaign on, and what talking points to feed to the press. We worked with most of the large outside groups and helped direct, I'd say, on the order of $500 or $600 million in ad spend. So first, I'm just going to start by going over what happened in the 2020 election. So this is just a table showing changes in support and turnout by race and education. And basically I'd say the right way to think about American politics and or the last 8 years of American politics, and I'll show this in graphs in a second, is basically that Democrats have done a lot better with college-educated white voters, and done worse with basically every other group over the past 8 years. That's basically canceled out. If you look at 2012, Barack Obama got about 52% of the two-party vote, and 8 years later, Joe Biden got 52.3% of the two-party vote. But underneath all of that, there have really been these tremendous subgroup shifts. From 2016 to 2020, there was a roughly 9% swing of Hispanic voters against Democrats. That means that nearly 1 in 10 Hispanic voters switched from voting for Clinton to voting for Donald Trump. And there were smaller but still meaningful declines among African Americans and Asian Americans. White voters overall, however, ended up getting, I think, contrary to the narrative, more Democratic, but that was masking, a swing where nearly all of that was concentrated among college-educated voters. So just to show this kind of realignment in graph form, what this graph over here shows, this is a scatter plot made in base R, where every single dot is a county. The tidyverse judging me. So every single dot is a county. And the x-axis shows the percentage of people in that county with a college degree. And the y-axis shows the change in two-way vote share from 2012 to 2020. And what you can see is that the most educated counties in the country, places like the Chicago or Detroit suburbs or the New York suburbs, became much more Democratic, while the least educated counties, which used to formerly be the base of the Democratic Party as recently as 10 years ago, became 20% more Republican. Each of these counties individually, I think, has an interesting story. One of my favorite is there's a town called Hayside, Virginia, near the West Virginia-Kentucky border, that voted 80% for basically every Democratic candidate, from FDR all the way out to Barack Obama. Barack Obama got 78% of the vote in this county in 2008. Joe Biden got 11%. It's a place where I think 95% of people don't have a college degree. And there's a bunch of other examples like it. Places where Walter Mondale won, or Michael Dukakis won. There's even one example of a place where Eugene Debs won. And now they're all solidly Republican. At the same time, Hispanic voters have also gotten quite Republican. This is a similar county-level scatter plot. And I think what's very interesting is if you look at some of the, I wouldn't say outliers, but some of the most Hispanic counties in the country, they're generally in South Texas. I think that the one with the single largest decline was a place called Starr County. And I think what's interesting about Starr County is that it's voted Democratic basically as long as it's existed, which is, I think, goes back to the 1890s. Barack Obama got, I think, something close to 80% of the vote there, and Donald Trump in 2020 won it. To kind of understand why this has happened, I think it's important to look at ideological identification. something that I think is super interesting is that even though partisanship varies dramatically by race, historically Democrats get about 40% of the white vote, something like 90% of the African American vote, and historically 70%, but now 60% of the Hispanic vote. Ideology doesn't vary very much by race. Roughly the same proportions of white, black, and Hispanic voters identify as liberal, moderate, or conservative. And mechanically, the way that that math works out is that historically, even though white voters are very polarized by ideology, Democrats get roughly 90% of white liberals and Republicans get roughly 80% of white conservatives. Democrats historically won non-white conservatives by very large margins. And so just what this table is, to finally get to it, is this is showing basically ideological identification by party, by race. And what you could see is that even though most college-educated white Democrats identify as liberal, for every other group, the majority of Democrats, whether they're non-college white, African American, or Hispanic, identify as moderate or conservative, while basically very few swing voters identify as liberal. So just to kind of illustrate what I was showing before, this is just showing the presidential vote share among Hispanics by ideology in 2012, 2016, and 2020. And what you could see is that in 2012 and 2016, Democrats won Hispanic conservatives by roughly 10 points. And in 2020, Donald Trump won Hispanic conservatives by 40 points. And that explains really most of the 2016 to 2020 decline. So now I'm just going to talk a little bit about the structural bias of American institutions. It's a happy topic. So the first thing, this is a pretty simple table that's just showing the relative vote share by state for every state in the country. And so the idea here is that Joe Biden got 52.3%. You just subtract that from everything to get a sense of how a 50-50 election would play out. And what you could see is first that there are only 38 senators that represent states that are more Democratic than the country overall. And the other thing you see is that the tipping point states, the states that decide control of the presidency, that was Wisconsin in 2020, or control of the Senate, that was North Carolina, are considerably more Republican than the country overall, which is how you have a scenario where Joe Biden got 52.3% of the vote, but didn't have the election called until nearly a month later. So just to illustrate that point, this is showing the partisan bias of the Electoral College over time. And to be really specific about what I mean by that, basically, when you have an election, you can rank the votes by vote share, and then you can look at the state that basically gets you over 270, that puts you over the top. That was Wisconsin in 2016 and 2020. It was Pennsylvania in 2012. It was Florida in 2000, for the folks who remember that. And then you can compare how you did in that state with how you did overall. And so what you can see is that really for most of America's post-war history, the bias of the Electoral College was fairly small. Even in 2000, when Democrats won the popular vote and lost the Electoral College, the difference between Florida and the country overall was still quite small, even if the outcome varied. But in 2016, something really dramatically changed. Basically because of this educational realignment that I talked about earlier, states that are heavily overrepresented in the Electoral College, namely the Midwest, states like Michigan, swung to the right, while Democrats' electoral fortunes improved dramatically in places that don't matter as much, like California or Washington or Oregon. And contrary to what a lot of people expected, that continued to grow in 2020, basically because college-educated whites continued to trend left while every other group continued to trend right. The Senate also has a pretty similar story. The Senate has always been biased against Democrats for the basic reason that the Senate overweights rural states relative to states with large populations. But the bias of the Senate more than doubled in 2016. And unfortunately, that bias matters more than ever. So just to talk a little bit about this table, and I'm going to focus on the correlation column here. In 2008, the correlation between Senate vote and presidential vote in a state was roughly 0.7. That's strong by social science standards, but it still left a lot of room for people like Heidi Heitkamp to win in 2012, despite Barack Obama losing that state by more than 20 points. Flash forwarding 8 years later, that correlation went from 0.7 to 0.95, which is a fancy way of saying that there are not that many Heidi Heitkamps anymore. And that's really bad because it means that the bias of the Senate is increased dramatically at exactly the time when it really matters more than ever. And also, I apologize for the plural pronouns here. I usually write toward a Democratic audience, but this is a nonpartisan audience. Just another thing here is that structurally, there's quite a bit less ticket splitting in general elections versus midterms, and I'll get to that at the end of this talk, just because the media environment is dominated by the presidential. And the class of senators that were up in 2018 are much more rural, and as a result trended much more against Democrats than the country overall. It was such a bad map for Democrats that Democrats lost 2 seats in 2018, despite getting 54% of the vote. And when they're up in 2024, this line just tries to show that it'll be much harder for them to win. All right, so I'm going to skip ahead and talk a little bit about policy polling and message testing. So, the interesting thing in our space, and I think that there's some interesting, maybe there are similar issues in other industries, is that most research that gets, or a very large fraction of research that gets funded in the Democratic Party is funded by issue advocacy groups who, generally speaking, want to show that their issues are popular. And as a result, basically every single Democratic policy priority that has ever been proposed is overwhelmingly popular in most of the polls that you look up. And it really makes you wonder how Democrats ever lose any elections. And so we spent a lot of time after the 2020 election to kind of comprehensively study which policies are actually popular and which ones aren't. I'm going to talk a little bit about our approach here, but the scale of it is something I'm really proud of. We worked with dozens of different congressional offices and ended up polling on the order of 350 policies, and we're able to disseminate that to decision makers. So the first thing, just to talk about how we do policy polling, is we provide partisan context. We let people know that the bill is something that Democrats support, because in the real world, if a political party is proposing a policy, voters will probably figure it out. We then try to have a reasonably neutral, detailed description of the bill. We notice that generally speaking, the more detail you put in, the worse it does, and there's something meaningful there. And then I think most importantly, rather than ask people whether they support the bill or oppose the bill, we present people randomized pro and con arguments and then ask them which side they agree with more. And this is super important just because in survey research, and I'm sure this is relevant outside of politics, if you ask people yes or no questions, people generally tend to say yes. Yes is heavily inflated. And this shows up in ballot measure polling. There's like a rule of thumb that if a ballot measure isn't polling at 60, it's going to lose. And it's pretty robust. It's been pretty robustly seen across a whole host of issues. The causes of it are kind of unclear. One really fun statistical bias that we've noticed is that when we give 5-factor personality tests to survey takers, they are considerably more agreeable than average, which makes a lot of sense if you think about what's happening. So doing things this way really ends up dramatically changing the results. It both changes the rank. This is a collection of 17 policies that we tested for one of our clients. And doing it in this way drops average support by 14 percentage points or 30 points in margin, and really considerably changes the rank order of what's popular and what's not. Like I said before, this is consistent with ballot measure results. This is a New York Times write-up of some excellent political science work by Chris Warshaw and Jonathan Robinson, where they basically looked across a whole host of issues, compared polling to actual election results, and found that polling considerably overestimated the popularity of liberal policy priorities. My favorite example is Maine, where polling at the time, there was a ballot measure on background checks. Polling at the time showed dramatic, 40 to 50 point leads for the ballot measure, and then on election day, it narrowly lost. So, here's just a meta-analysis of what we found for what's popular and what's not. The first thing we see is that average two-way support's about 53. Only about 56% of policies outperform partisanship, and some very common. I guess the other thing I'd say here that I think is important is we tried to break this down ideologically in two ways. First, policies that Manchin has supported, and then another is policies that AOC supports but Joe Biden does not. And obviously the averages are different, but that really isn't the point. I think what's very interesting about this is that there are a lot of progressive policies that are quite popular. The second most popular policy we polled is AOC's Loan Shark Prevention Act, which caps credit card interest rates at 15%. And then the flip side is that there are a lot of Manchin-supported policies that are also unpopular. And this is, the importance of testing things, because popularity doesn't necessarily fall on ideological lines. So one cool thing that we do is that we try to actually rigorously measure issue salience and issue importance over time. We do that by basically showing people two random policies, and we ask them which is more important. What's more important, healthcare or education? And we do that for tens of thousands of people every week, and we've been doing that over the last 2 years. And something that comes through very clearly is that rich Democrats and rich people in general care about completely different things than working class people, where richer Democrats care a lot more about things like climate change or national security, while poorer Americans are a lot more likely to care about poverty, housing, cost of living, and other issues that I think aren't talked about nearly as much in progressive press. This is a graph that just tries to, I think this is super interesting. Every single one of these dots is a policy, where on the x-axis we measured how popular the policy is, and on the y-axis we actually did randomized controlled trials where we basically made messages telling people to support a candidate because of the policy that they supported, and found that there's a pretty clear relationship between how popular a policy is and how effective talking about it is. I like to joke that this is the most controversial slide in Democratic politics. It's funny that you have to test that talking about more popular things is important, but it is useful to say out loud. So another thing we did that we've done, I mentioned this at the top of this, is that we've done randomized controlled trials for literally thousands. I think the exact number is about 14,000 different pieces of content. And basically for each of them figured out what is the incremental effect of exposing someone to this ad or this argument on their chance of voting for a Democrat. And so here we just have some averages by tag. We can see that Social Security continues its 70-year streak of being the most popular and effective message for Democrats. But other important issues that came up this cycle, like healthcare, abortion, the reconciliation package, ended up testing fairly well. While other topics, such as student loans, January 6th, or immigration, did test fairly poorly. But even within issue area, and this is kind of what a lot of our work ends up looking like, it turns out that how exactly you choose to make an argument in a given issue area can really make a big difference. Here we can see the top two abortion-related messages that we've tested, and they are, I think, literally 20 times more effective than the bottom two. So now, getting closer to the end and leaving time for questions, talking about what actually happened a week ago. So the first thing is just to start with is that midterms are usually very bad. So this is showing the change in vote share for the party that controls the presidency from the presidential election to the next midterm election. And what you could see is that the party that controls the presidency typically has very large losses, with one of the only exceptions being 2002 in the wake of 9/11. And if you actually look at polling really right up until June, all of the signs were really pointing toward this kind of trend continuing. Democrats lost the Virginia gubernatorial, they nearly lost New Jersey. Democrats were doing poorly in basically every special election that was happening. And then, obviously, something changed. So here we're just looking at 2 indicators that nerds like to look at in order to get a sense of elections that don't involve polling, because polling is wrong sometimes, as we all know. The first is looking at party primaries. Dobbs very conveniently split the number of, basically Dobbs happened in the middle of primary season, so roughly half of primaries were before Dobbs and roughly half of them were after. And something that people do is they like to look at what percentage of people who vote in the Democratic primary versus the Republican primary. Historically, that's a very good indicator for how the elections go. And what we could see is there was an immediate, I think, 2.7% shift in the percentage of people who voted in the Democratic primary. And then another thing that people look at is special elections. There are special elections happening all the time due to retirements and other things like that. And prior to Dobbs, basically Democrats were on average underperforming Joe Biden's performance in their districts by about 3%. And post-Dobbs, that jumped to 2%. These are quite large shifts. So just to talk about the actual election results themselves, the first salient finding that I think that we've been able to see looking at the data so far is that, kind of contrary to the narrative, Democratic turnout was lower than Republican turnout. It really seems like the electorate this year was roughly 2 to 3% more Republican than it was in 2020. There's kind of 2 different ways that we're showing this here. First is looking at relative turnout rates from 2020 among Biden and Trump counties by state. And then the other is looking at precinct data in the 3 states that we've scraped precinct data so far. And what you could generally see with all of this is that Democratic areas had lower turnout than Republican areas almost everywhere in the country, with the possible exception of Wisconsin. But Democrats won anyway, because Democratic incumbents in close races did much better than everywhere else. And so just to explain this chart, here we break out how the Democrat did relative to Biden, and break that out by whether it was a swing district or not, and by Democratic incumbency. And what you can see here, and I know there's a lot of bars, so sorry about that, is if you compare Democratic incumbents in swing districts, they either were at par with Biden or outperformed Biden. And then in literally every other combination, we see a red wave materialize, with Democrats considerably underperforming Biden by 3 or 4 points. I just want to say I've been following elections, obviously, for some time, both here and abroad, and I've never actually seen anything like this. This is really a giant deviation from what the political scientists call uniform swing. And the rest of this is just going to try to deconstruct a little bit about why we think that happened. The first is that Democrats heavily outspent Republicans in the right races. So this is showing GRPs, or gross ratings points. That's TV speak for TV impressions per person times 100. I don't know why it's 100. I don't make the rules. And what you could see is basically that more than Republicans, Democrats both put more ads on the air overall, and put more ads in the right places than their opponents did. Distance from the 50th seat is just, the 50th seat was Nevada, and the idea is that Democrats, to maximize their chance of majority, should put the most spending in the places closest, and that's exactly what they did. Their largest net spending advantage and absolute spending advantage was exactly in the state that ended up determining control of the Senate. And on top of that, Democrats didn't just spend more in swing races, they also had better ads. We tested every single Democratic and Republican ad that went on the air this cycle, at least in the Senate, not all the House ones, but a lot of them. And what we could see is that Democrats did a better job. We have a couple of columns here, which is the percentage of impressions by topic, and then the effect of those topics relative to the average ad. And what you could see is that Democrats put most of their spending behind the topics that were most effective, namely the economy and abortion, while Republicans generally did a much worse job of that. I think there's kind of 2 different things that I want to call out at the bottom of these tables. The first is that basically 0 ads mentioned January 6th in any way. The ads that did mention January 6th tended to do quite poorly. I do think that it did play a big role in fundraising, but I think it is worth tying out that this election really had a lot more to do with reproductive rights, I think, than democracy. And then I think on the Republican side, just to kind of highlight, their failure to pick topics well, there were very few Republican ads on abortion, but the ones that they did have, which generally tried to distance themselves from some of the more extreme stated Republican policies, did extremely well. But it only made up 3% of the ad impressions that they put out, and I think it ended up being responsible for them losing a lot of winnable races. And so the sum total of these factors allowed Democrats to defy political gravity. What we can see is that even though Democrats, it looks like, are going to get about 48.5% of the vote, that's going to put them with more seats than in 1998, when Democrats did nearly 1% better, and when the bias of the congressional maps was something like 2% better. It really is pretty jarring. I'd say that Democrats got something like 11 or 12 more seats than they should have, basically due to this disproportionate advantage in the closest races that came from campaign effects. So yeah, that's the talk. The rest of the time is yours for questions. Thanks for listening to me talk. Yeah, I think that one of the, just to explain, some context, historically Democrats used to do very, very well in the South, and people would call these kind of conservative Southern Democrats Dixiecrats. They realigned federally maybe in the 60s, but really Democrats were continuing to do well. My favorite fact is that Democrats controlled the Mississippi State Senate until 2011, which is crazy. And I think that it's an interesting thing. I think that a lot of American political scientists kind of missed this education realignment and didn't see it coming because they thought it was just the Southern realignment when really the rest of the Midwest realigned too. I think the story of the last 8 years has really been one of intra-regional convergence. If you want to understand why are Democrats doing so well in Georgia and why are they struggling so much in places like Ohio, it's basically that Democrats used to do unusually well with non-college whites in Ohio or Iowa. White people in Iowa in 2012 were actually more Democratic than white people in New Jersey, which is a crazy fact. But they've kind of converged toward the national mean, while white voters in places like Georgia or North Carolina have kind of converged toward the national mean. But these realignments, still are happening. But I'd say that that's probably the right way to think about it, is that we're kind of seeing this collapse of regional identities and kind of moving more toward nationalized politics on education lines.
And we also have mics up over here and over here at the stand if people want to line up there for questions.
I'm just going to throw one data question your way, David, which is the turnout numbers at this point when they're still partial. Are you comparing them to what they looked like partially on the other years? And how do we think that plays given the sort of shifts in dynamics of partisan turnout vis-a-vis early voting and election day voting?
All of this data is using fully completed counties. Some parts of the country count much faster than others. Obviously, we're not going to know the overall number of votes in the U.S. until December. But in places that, basically don't, basically the divide is that some states allow you to have postmark your ballots by election day, and others it has to arrive by election day. But really, in most of the country, we're within 1% to 2% of our overall vote total count. Counts, and so all of this, we took some care to try to make correct comparisons.
Another data question. How did you, for overall party split, how do you account for like races that are unopposed? Like the Republicans had about double the unopposed races as opposed to Democrats.
Yeah, for this we simply exclude those since we're looking at average swing. But that is generally a problem with that is generally a problem with overall popular vote. I do think a lot of these things end up canceling out, or more accurately, every time you try to adjust for unopposed races, I think it ends up making things worse. It's kind of a hard problem. The basic issue is just that people who run unopposed, you can try to do various imputations, but usually they're unopposed for a reason, and so there's some trickiness there. Right now, it's easier to exclude them.
Thanks again for being here. How do you explain these numbers to politicians, and how do you get them to, if they're not immediately adept at understanding these, how do you communicate the meaning of them and persuade, sort of get them to pay attention? I'd be interested in that process.
Yeah, I really like this question, just because, just something I think about a lot in the past 10 years is I hear a lot of other people who work in politics, and I think this is a common refrain where people will just say, "Oh, these pointy-haired bosses, they don't understand data. We need a data person in the room." And I felt that way when I was 20 years old and first working in politics. And something I've kind of come to appreciate is that it's really hard, to get leadership jobs. These are very hard jobs to get, and the people who have them are often really quite smart. And if there's something that they're not getting, or if they disagree with you, most of the time it's because they understand something that you don't. Even if they don't understand math. One statistic, it's not really a statistic, but something I like to say is that, when I worked in the Obama campaign in 2012, it was like all of these, I was 20, but I don't know, the median age was maybe like 24, and it was the first time anyone had ever really used polling in a campaign. But there was this outside set of consultants who had been working in politics for decades, and we hated them. I remember we had this poster that was like, destroy the consultants, save the world, which is a Heroes reference, if anyone remembers that. But, I think looking back on it, I think that maybe like 80% of the things that we disagreed on, they were right, and I was wrong. And so I think that that's a lot of the challenge, is I think that how do you distill these things in a way that people can understand? We spend a lot of time doing that. I swear that the graphics usually look better than this. But I think that the process of doing it just tends to make our work a lot better. I think it's definitely not the case that we have these secret truths that are just incomprehensible to understand. I think there are very few things in the world that are actually that complicated. And so I don't know, that's kind of the answer I'll give.
Thank you for the really interesting talk. I was wondering how feasible it will be to do this analysis outside of the two-party framework, right? The fact that you're finding rich Democrats don't agree with rich or poor Democrats hopefully should not be a surprise, because this is more about class struggle. So can you do this in terms of do you already have the data, or do you not have that data?
We've done some work in other countries. I think something I would really recommend, on the broader topic of education polarization and the extent to which center-left parties have kind of talked less about class struggle and talked more about social issues. Thomas Piketty has done some really excellent work on this. It's kind of cool to have Thomas Piketty jump into your little weird micro subfield. But he had a big paper that came out that looked at this cross-nationally, taking into account multi-party structure. Really highly recommend it if you want to learn more about the topic.
I'll ask a question while we're waiting for the audience. So a lot of what you're looking at is what messages and policies are popular or successful. How do you think about the shift in popular opinion that happens either over a number of years, or even specific candidates can be very charismatic and they can make people care about things that reading it on a survey they might not care about? Yeah,
things change, which is annoying, or good sometimes. But I think just to talk a little bit about the big shift this cycle was that we tracked 33 different issues. It's I think the ones that we hold on, that are listed over here. And, we track both party trust, what party do you trust more on, say, abortion rights or voting rights, Democrats or Republicans, and we also track salience, how important people find these things. And before Dobbs, voters listed abortion as the, I think, 30th most important issue out of 30th in terms of what they saw as the top problems facing the country. And it was a pretty neutral issue for Democrats. I think it was like 15th out of 30th. And immediately after Dobbs, that changed dramatically in a way that's really quite, I'm just going to go back to here, in a way that's really quite rare. Basically overnight, abortion went from being the 30th most important issue to being the 12th. And party trust, it went from being basically middle of the pack to being basically the single best issue for Democrats, and that kind of happened overnight. Those kind of things are very rare. I do think it's it does require something very dramatic, like overturning Roe v. Wade. But the important thing is being able to measure these things when they exist and respond appropriately.
So I have two related questions, I guess. One is how prevalent you see this kind of use of data analytics at various levels of election, right? The things that you're talking about, the right messaging and the right places to fund the elections. I wonder, first of all, at what levels that happens, and then the second is how precise will it get, in your opinion? At some point it becomes precision agriculture, precision medicine, and precision, political campaigning, and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's been really interesting. This is a field that didn't exist 10 years ago. I guess this is probably true for data science and X for all X. But what I would say is at this point, data is involved in almost every major decision that ends up happening. Whether it's how much money gets spent between different races, whether I think at this point, almost every ad that goes on the air in a competitive race ends up being tested one way or another. And at this point, even comms, a lot is heavily driven by talking point testing. And that's very cool. None of this was true 4 years ago. I think that the total number of ads tested in the Democratic Party in 2016 was 2, and I think this cycle it was probably on the order of 6,000 or 7,000, and that's really just a pretty dramatic change. And a lot of that comes from changes. Measurement has gotten changes in technology. Measurement's gotten a lot cheaper. Like on our end. In 2012, people were running Stata locally, and now, we score billions of rows a day. So everything has really gotten quite a bit simpler. To answer your second question, maybe a bit indirectly, I do think that it's not the case that there's some magic sentence that makes people vote for Democrats. I think a lot of what we try to adjust for is just that the people who work in politics are very weird. We're much younger than the overall population. We're much more educated. We live in cities, and kind of the point of the slide I wanted to hold on. Kind of the point of this slide is just that the stuff that we care about is very different than the people that we're trying to persuade or the people we're trying to turn out to vote. And so I think that most of the value of what we're doing is to kind of help people step outside of their biases and talk more like politicians used to talk a long time ago. I think sometimes when I present this kind of stuff to older voters, I think that my co-founder actually at one point got to present something like this to Joe Biden before he was president. And the reaction is, oh, yeah, Social Security. Yeah, we knew that. Yeah, voters really like Social Security. And Joe Biden gets that, but the 25-year-olds working on his campaign might not necessarily. And so a lot of the testing is just to kind of counteract these ideological biases that we have.
On the theme of testing, I'd be curious if you could talk a little more about the modeling components here. What are some of the main, engineering infrastructures that you've had to set up, and what are some of the main engineering challenges that you and your team are grappling with, especially in the months leading up to a big election?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, the big thing that we do is we fit large-scale Bayesian multi-level models. And, the reason for that, we just to kind of think of what this could look like, is you could imagine over the course of a 1 to 2 year period, you survey something like 2 million people, and you ask each of them, what are they going to vote for the Democrat or the Republican in their race? And if you think about how to actually deal with that, you have big district differences. Districts in New York act very differently and acted very differently than districts in places like Colorado. You have things varying dramatically over time. You have subgroup variation. And so our approach is that we fit these large multi-level models on the data and then kind of post-stratify over this big voter file that we have of every person in the country. The primary technical challenge we have there is that Bayesian methods traditionally are very slow. Normally, people would use things like STAN, and STAN is great if you have 15,000 rows and 7 columns, but we have 2 million rows and hundreds of columns. And so a lot of what we do is trying to approximate that kind of work using variational inference and TensorFlow probability. That's very hard. Don't use variational inference unless you absolutely have to. It's my advice. But yeah, I would say that the big engineering challenge we have is that every day we're surveying really large numbers of people. We have dozens of different models, each of which are trained on millions of rows. And then we have to score, cumulatively between all of them, billions of rows. And we have to do this all in something like 2 or 3 hours, just because we need to have the shortest, response time that we can when people make ads. When people make ads, you need to give them the results as quickly as possible. Otherwise, it gets stale.
Just to your left, there's...
Thank you. Great talk, really great talk, Karen Fireman. I'm curious, how are you starting to change your methods? You started to say that people who answer surveys are really optimistic or nice people or easy to get along with or whatever. What are you finding this is a two-part question. What are you finding you have to do to still get accurate results, given which you sound like you're saying is starting to be a bias? And the other question, which is a pretty dumb one, I think, but I'll ask it anyway, is does the money that people spend on campaigns really matter in terms of the donations to those campaigns?
Great questions. So the first thing, survey takers being really weird. This is the primary thing that makes what we do really hard. If you go back to the 1940s, response rates were just a lot higher. I think that something like 80% of people used to answer the phone when you call them, and that number is down to 0.6%, which is quite bad. And it turns out that once you get to 1 in 200 people picking up the phone, those people are really very strange across a whole host of dimensions. I mentioned earlier that they're more agreeable. They tend to have much higher trust in institutions. If you ask them, do you think people can generally be trusted? They're substantially more likely to say yes. They tend to have very different kinds of jobs. They're much more likely to have office jobs. They're much less likely to work in retail or manufacturing. There's really a whole host of things. And kind of the big way that we try to deal with this, there's kind of two approaches you can have. One is you can try to have more people answer surveys. That's really hard and really expensive. You can spend hundreds of dollars per respondent and still only get something like 20% of people to answer. And the other is that you can try to control for more things. So, traditional pollsters, control for a very small number of things like age, race, education, things that are in the census. We control for a much wider basket of things like social trust, attitude, things like authoritarianism, attitudes toward the Bible, and a whole host of other things. It's hard. There's a reason other people don't do it, but, that's kind of the central challenge that we have, is how do we collect how can we control for as much characteristics so that we can quantify exactly how weird survey takers are. And then I think the other question, just like do donations by people matter? The point of this plot is to say yes. It really, I think a big reason why why Democrats won this cycle is that they managed to heavily outspend in the right places. And I think something that's kind of interesting about donations is this is not super well known, but there's this thing called the unit rule, which is that campaigns, and not committees and not super PACs, so never give your money to to a committee. Campaigns specifically have to be charged the lowest possible price for TV advertising. In close races, this makes literally a 10-to-1 difference. And so, the importance of small donors targeting their donations correctly is really pretty paramount. I mentioned over here that Democrats had way more impressions than the Republicans did. And it's funny because if you look at this by dollars, it doesn't quite look that way. And one of the big reasons is that there were so many more Democratic small donors who were able to have an outsized impact on how their dollars converted into ads.
Thank you. David Corliss from GM. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is the process and the turnaround time and how you turn things around so quickly. Give a couple quick examples if in other fields. When new airlines come out with special incentives, they usually cut rate airlines first on Tuesday mornings, and by Tuesday afternoon, the major players are offering discounts to the same places. Or in the automotive industry, one big manufacturer, let's say, they put a big discount on trucks, and the next day the other manufacturers have a big discount on trucks. They're able to turn it around very quickly. What is the process you use so you get your data that you're collecting in real time? How does that get into performance? How fast does it happen? The real target of this question, what can somebody like me, working for a big automotive company, learn from folks like you to respond more quickly to the market?
Yeah, I'd say the big thing, we've learned, because this is a product category that really didn't exist 6 years ago. I remember in the 2012 campaign, someone came to us and said, we'd like to test some ads. We did some back of the envelope calculations, and we were like, with 95% confidence, in order to get 95% confidence, it'll cost $2 million and take 5 weeks, and then they rolled their eyes and walked away. I think that there were like a couple of insights. The first is that 95% confidence is like a bad decision interval. If you can very quickly tell a campaign manager, I think there's an 80% chance that this ad is better than this ad, and you can do that in a day or two as opposed to a week, they'll very happily take that. So I think that kind of being more flexible and figuring out like better ways to present people information has been a big part of it. But I think a really big thing is that research has traditionally been very artisanal, where you have like a pollster who's like a grizzled veteran with decades of political experience, and he has like a grad student working for him, and maybe there's some 22-year-olds, and you have this long, in-depth thing where you come up with this bespoke research instrument, and it's really slow and it's really labor intensive. Kind of our approach, and this has helped just because we're a nonprofit, is that we just decided we're going to test all the ads, and so we need to build infrastructure that allows us to test hundreds of things a week, and have a really standardized analysis plan for all of them, and do it in a way so that every single ad can be compared to every other ad. And so I think standardization and scale has been the really big thing. I think that it's really hard to solve problems one at a time, but if you're looking across an industrial kind of process, things have gotten, I don't know, it's helped a lot. I probably have more to learn from you than you from me, to be honest.
All right, we'll take one final question up in the back.
No, yeah. So on the subject of challenges of doing polling, so I know in 2016 and certainly in 2020 there was some there's a high polling errors, but it wasn't like uniform. Like in some states, for example, here in Michigan, there was a relatively higher error in like the polls, like particularly the polls that in the media, like prior to the presidential election. Can you like talk about some of the reasons why that was the case?
Yeah, I basically the right way to think about this is that basically sociologists talk a lot about socioeconomic status or class, Class is more complex than income or education, which you can control for in polls, where if you have two people with a college degree, but one had working class parents and another didn't, they'll vote quite differently. They'll see the world fairly differently. And so this kind of latent socioeconomic status has always been very correlated with survey response. At people who are more educated, people who come from more affluent backgrounds, people with higher status occupations have always been more likely to answer surveys. It just used to not matter very much because it wasn't super correlated with voting. But in 2016, it became very correlated with voting. And ever since then, we've seen this really persistent regional variation in polling error, where we overestimate Democrats in lower education parts of the country, like the Midwest, and underestimate Democrats in places that are more educated, like Georgia or California. I think that this error, it's a little too early to say, but I think it still was there. You can see it in some places. Even though Democrats outperformed expectations generally, Democrats did much worse than the public polls in Ohio and places where the polling had missed previously. And so that's, I think, the basic gist of it is just that even though they're waiting on education, they're kind of getting the wrong non-college grads. I have some slides on this from another talk, but the non-college whites that they're getting report much higher levels of trust. They're much more likely to work in offices as opposed to retail or construction or manufacturing, and really across a whole host of other indicators. They end up being they tend to end up having a variety of class markers that aren't representative of working class white people overall.
That wraps up our session. David, thank you so much for this wonderful talk and fascinating discussion.
Thanks. So I want to